you. Dr. Urban is an associate professor of economics at Montana State University. She's a research fellow at the Institute for the Study of Labor and a faculty affiliate of the Center for Financial Security at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's been a visiting scholar at both the Federal Reserve Board and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. She's an incredibly prolific researcher and the leading national expert when it comes to state mandates on financial education. She's just plain awesome, and we're so lucky to have her here to talk to us today. So Carly, thank you. I appreciate you being here. Take it away.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for, I just realized today that in the calendar invite you wrote Carly Awesome Urban. So I appreciate it, definitely cheered up my day. So today I'm going to talk about some brand new research that's actually not really been presented yet. So there will be a webinar on this in a week or so, October 6th, where we're going to talk more about the policy. But I thought this would be a great way to kind of throw some new research out there. And we're really going to be looking at the effect of state mandates on financial well-being, and we're going to think about that in a very subjective way. So this is joint work with Jeremy Burke at USC and Michael Collins at the University of Wisconsin. This work was supported by a grant from the FINRA Foundation. If you know anything about FINRA, they have a lot of lawyers. So just speaking for myself today. Just to kind of motivate what we're going to be asking, we know that the recent pandemic has really put a spotlight on financial precarity of many families. A lot of people are struggling right now, and policymakers are constantly thinking about one way to improve the financial security of these future generations of young people right now, to try to give them some a better footing for starting their adult independence in terms of their finances. So we want to think about requiring personal finance education in high school, so these graduation requirements. And we really want to think about this not just as a strong objective financial situation, which the literature has clearly shown in the past, savings, earnings, ability to manage one's money. But we also want to think about the skills and the confidence to make good decisions. So we want to set people up to make better financial decisions. The CFPB has spent a lot of time in the last 5 years trying to develop a measure of what we think subjective financial well-being should be. So what we're going to ask is, does state mandated financial education affect that scale that has been developed over the last 5 years? So the CFPB has been defining this financial well-being measure as being in control of your day-to-day or month-to-month finances, having the ability to absorb a financial shock. So like the current state of the world, lots of people are having to absorb shocks. Whether or not you can meet your financial goals. And that's going to be really important because everyone's goals can be different. This entire scale is supposed to be independent of your wealth and income in some ways. So your financial goals might be having a loft in Manhattan, or it might be having chickens in the middle of nowhere. Whatever that is, are you able to meet that? And then having the financial freedom to make choices that allow you to enjoy life. Okay, so those are kind of what it's trying to capture. I'm going to plot a histogram across all different income bands and show you what the scale looks like. So it goes from 0 to 100. And you'll see that for every income band, there's a full distribution of scores. So there are people who are making over $150,000 a year that feel really bad about their finances. And then there's a lot of people who feel really good about them. The same thing with people who are making under $20,000 a year. There are some people who feel pretty good, and there are some people who feel pretty terrible. So we see this whole band. The red line is the national average. So you will see that income is correlated with financial well-being, where that whole plot is shifted to the left for those who are making less than 20,000, and those who are making over 150,000, it's shifted to the right. But a lot of those income bands in the middle are pretty evenly distributed, regardless of the fact that they're different income levels. Okay, so some of my previous work, in addition to some work by others that you may or may not be aware of, shows that state mandated financial education is overall a really good thing for objective financial situations. So for example, we find that financial education in high school increases credit scores, reduces delinquency rates. It improves post-secondary financing decisions, which means it shifts students from higher cost to lower cost borrowing methods. So they actually borrow more in terms of public student loans, but they're less likely to use credit card debt to finance college, which is really costly. At the same time, Daniel Mangrum has a paper that shows that financial education in high school increases the likelihood that you repay your student loans. And that effect is particularly large for first generation students. So those that didn't have parents who went to college, where financial education is probably more likely to be effective and useful. Melody Harvey has some work that shows that state mandated financial education decreases high cost borrowing such as payday loans. And it does that, she can show for all different types of people. So for different races and ethnicities, males and females, lots of different characteristics of the student. And the effect is actually no different across any of those groups. It's equally effective for everyone. And then finally, she has some work showing that there is an increase in the likelihood of saving and the amount of saving for low income populations, and particularly for those who never go to college. So that's going to be an important finding for us later. No one so far has looked at subjective measures. So we know these objective measures are improving, but how are people feeling about it? The other kind of interesting motivation for this is that if you look at that financial well-being scale over the life cycle, starting at age 25 and going to age 75 plus, men always have higher financial well-being than women at almost every stage of the life course. And those people who have a college education or more have higher financial well-being than those who end their education at high school or those who just go on to some college. So we do see these big gaps. We can't tell if that's some people being more confident than maybe they should be, or kind of the opposite. Like, are women underconfident and men overconfident, or is it, we can't tell. But that's going to be, again, a motivating factor for splitting the sample up in a bunch of different ways and seeing who financial education changes subjective financial well-being for more or less. Okay, so again, does state mandated financial education affect subjective financial well-being? And are these effects different for those who end their education with a high school diploma or by gender? Okay, so we're going to be the first to actually look at this causal effect. We're actually going to be able to look at it through age 45. So we have enough time post when these policies came into effect to actually estimate really long run effects, and that's pretty cool. So we're not just saying right away after you take the class, how do you feel about your finances? We're saying, 20-ish years later, how do you feel, right? A little bit more than that. Okay. So we're going to use data. We collected additional data on when states passed these graduation requirements and what the first graduating class that was affected was. We're going to look at all of these different types of graduation requirements. So some of those are standalone courses, right? So some states require a full semester of personal finance. Some of them integrate that into another subject. Some of them just have really substantial standards in personal finance that are in a larger content area like social studies. We would love to have more variation that we could say like this type is more effective than this type, but we just can't do that. We don't have enough power in our study. So here is our data. The green states are those that don't have any financial education requirements. In each state we map, we have the year of the first graduating class that was required to take personal finance. If any of you are looking at this and saying my state isn't right, I'd love to hear from you. This is data that I've been trying to track really carefully for a very long time. And sometimes it's hard to figure out exactly what that first graduating cohort was. I won't prime you on which states I am less or more confident in, but I would love to hear what you have to say about that. So in case, I'm sure I probably don't need to say anything about what happens in high school financial education courses to this group. You guys know pretty well. This is kind of what the average graduation requirement standard looks like. So something about debt with different interest rates, understanding credit scores, longer term debt, so mortgages, auto loans, or student debt, credit card use, income fluctuations and insuring against risk. And then comparing salaries across occupations, monthly budgets, things like that are really common in these courses. There's a lot of other topics that are in some states' standards and not others. So this is kind of just the big the big categories. So there's two channels we really think about when we're trying to figure out how financial education might affect financial well-being. One is it might change your expectations. So you learn about what your future income actually will be, and you learn about what budgeting looks like, you learn about what debt's gonna be like, and you're like, wow, I'm gonna have a lot less than I thought I would have. Maybe I'll either one, change my goals or change my ability to meet those current goals. So maybe more realistically. At the same time, it might just have this behavior change, kind of similar to what we thought about in the observational outcomes, where you learn how to make smarter decisions earlier on in life so you don't rack up credit card debt on unnecessary consumption. You improve your financial situation early on, and then that could increase your ability to absorb shocks and then increase your financial well-being in the long run. So it could be a little bit of both. We're going to use data from the National Financial Capability Study from the Finner Investor Education Foundation. It's nationally representative. It's also state representative. It has that financial well-being scale that the CFPB created. It is the 5-item, not the 10-item scale, but it's pretty representative. We're going to restrict our sample again to this 18 to 45-year-old population. If we trim it in different ways, it really doesn't change our results. So if we look at a younger population, or if we start them at 25 after they've probably finished college, it really changes nothing. So to preempt that question. And we have a sample of about 12,000 some. Okay. So like in our previous work, we're going to compare students in states with financial education graduation requirements before and after those requirements took effect. So you graduated just before and just after. We're going to compare those two cohorts to each other. We're then also going to make that same comparison in states without graduation requirements across the exact same time period to take out those national trends. And then we're going to compare the difference in the growth rates across those two. Now, if you don't like words and you prefer pictures in terms of explanations, let me throw it at you a different way. So Texas introduced their graduation requirement with the first cohort was the graduating class of 2007. We would compare that graduating cohort in 2007 to the graduating cohort in 2006, okay? And they did not have to take any personal finance. And then we'd also want to take into account that other things were happening in 2007, right? Like a recession. So we can't just compare that 2007 to the 2006. We also just can't compare Texas graduates in 2007 to those in New Mexico, a state that had no financial education graduation requirements at the time, because those two educational systems are completely different, right? So if we took that difference, we would just be comparing differences in systems. But what we can do is we can compare within Texas this before and after. So we can compare the 2007 and the 2006 graduating cohorts in Texas, and we can compare the 2007 and 2006 graduating cohorts in New Mexico, and then we can compare those two growth rates. So that's what we're going to do to take care of that national trend, and then also kind of use these states that do and don't pass as controls. But we're going to do it, think about that exact model, now just scale it up to think about all the states that passed and didn't pass. Okay, so here are the results. So I'm going to first show you the overall result, and then I'm going to break it out in a few different ways. So the overall result is looking at everybody. And overall, we generally see this increase in financial well-being based on whether or not you had financial education required in high school. Now, if we break it down further, we'll see that that increase is almost entirely driven by men. So men see this almost 2-point increase in their financial well-being score, which I'll tell you more about what that means in a minute. And women see no change. There's no improvement, no reduction. They're not doing worse. They're just not changing how they feel about their financial situation. Okay. And again, recall that this is long run. So this isn't right after they took the class. This is 20 something years later, right? Anytime between 18 and 45. Okay, so in addition to this gender divide, we're seeing that people who ended their education at high school are actually having a reduction in their financial well-being score after financial education. And at the same time, those who have some college or a college degree or more are doing better. Okay, so when you first see this, you're like, oh my gosh, there's these huge inequalities in what's going on in financial education. How do we better serve women? How do we better serve the high school only population? Let me break it down for you a little bit more. So if we look specifically at these 5 questions and we try to figure out which ones are changing within that entire scale, women don't see a change in any of the 5 questions. Literally tight zeros, nothing's changing. They're just not responding any differently than the women who had no exposure semi-randomly to financial education. Okay, so I think part of that might be that there could be some increases and decreases at the same time that are maybe averaging each other out. Regardless, no changes. Men, on the other hand, seem to be less concerned that the money that they have won't last. They're less likely to feel like they won't have the things in life because of money, and they're less likely to feel like their finances control their lives. So again, this could be a story of men having financial education than just feeling really confident, right? It kind of amps up their confidence even in the very long run. These are not like objective questions. These are definitely subjective, how you're feeling questions. Now, the results by education are a little bit more telling. So for the high school only sample, these people who are ending all of their education with a high school diploma, they're saying that after financial education, they're more likely to feel like they will never have the things they want in life because of money, right? So money is really driving their expectations for the future. And again, this is down the road. So this isn't just like right away, oh my gosh, I'm not gonna have the things I want in life. I'm gonna change my behavior. This is years later. They're still saying, hey, I realize now I'm not gonna have the things I want. Is that a bad thing? Is this an ignorance is bliss type of story, where those people who ended their education with high school but didn't have with a high school diploma but did not have any financial education aren't as likely to say that, right? So it's the education that's changing their expectation and their future, their thoughts on their future. In terms of the other 2 groups, the college degree plus looks a lot more like what men said, where they seem more confident. And the some college population was actually kind of interesting. They're more likely to say they have money left over at the end of the month. So that's the only group for whom we actually have a question where they're changing their response to something like very objective, like, yeah, I have money left over at the end of the month, I'm saving. So how do we kind of reconcile this, understand the effect size a little bit more? Prior studies show that job loss has reduced financial well-being about 4.2 points. And we're finding that for men, it's increasing financial well-being by about 1.8 points. So that's about less than half, 44% the size of job loss. But we want to think about job loss as something that's episodic, short-term probably. And financial knowledge is probably something that's retained or augmented over the life course. So that could be something to kind of consider in putting those 2 together, but that's a relatively large effect. And then finally, in other research I've done, we found that only about 48% of schools within these states that have graduation requirements actually comply when you look at what the local high schools are doing. So it makes the effect actually even larger, so probably double that, which is kind of interesting. Finally, we do some more work to look at objective financial situations across these populations. If you remember from earlier, Melody Harvey's work suggests that high school people with only a high school degree after financial education are more likely to have savings and have a little bit more in savings. We do see some improvements in objective financial situations in our data due to state mandated financial education. So they're more likely to have a rainy day account or a checkings or savings account. Both men and women see those effects. They're more likely to figure out how much is needed for retirement. There's no clear gains in our data for those who only hold a high school diploma, but there's actually no harm. So there's no reason to think that something about their objective situation after financial education is lowering their financial well-being. We can also rule out a bunch of other things. These are questions I commonly get when I'm just talking to people about this research. It's not household formation. So the effects are actually similar for single and married individuals. And we can show you that financial education doesn't affect whether or not you get married, whether or not you have kids, things like that. We see that financial education doesn't really change income. There's a little bit of evidence that for women and for the high school only sample, they're less likely to be in that lowest income bracket, but it's pretty, the evidence isn't that great. If we drop each state one at a time, it's not just one state driving our effects. And then also if we control for your asset levels or your household income, it doesn't change our effects on financial well-being. So that's kind of additional evidence that the objective financial situation isn't really what's driving these changes in subjective well-being. Okay, so how would I kind of wrap all of this up? Well, based on our previous research and research from others, I still think state-mandated financial education really improves financial behaviors, especially objective financial situations. It's also improving financial well-being for men and those with at least some college in the subjective terms. And people who end their education with high school diplomas have these gains in other outcomes, but not in the subjective well-being in our study, and it actually is lowering financial well-being. So we have to be careful of a few things. One, financial education may actually just raise awareness of your financial fragility. And if you're around other people who have stronger finances, you might feel a lot worse about yourself, and that might persist for a long time. Policies that promote financial education might actually want to think more carefully about these populations, thinking like particularly about income fluctuations, or thinking less about including student loans in all these curricula. If there are subpopulations for whom college is not really something that they want to do, then learning how to incorporate more units on fragility and managing month-to-month paychecks, or living paycheck to paycheck, and kind of getting yourself into the best situation you can if you have a lot of shocks. Like, different types of topics might be more important for that population versus the college going population. I think that's all I got for you today. And then thinking more about like this gender difference, I think women probably learn a little bit differently from men. I've been trying to think if there are more female or male teachers in the personal finance space, if one is more or less affected. It seems like there's more female teachers, if anything, from what I've gathered from others who are doing teacher training, but more systematic data on that would be amazing. Cool. Well, I'm happy to take any questions you guys have. Interested to see.
Carly, this is Derek D'Angelo from Michigan. I've got a question on the map that you showed. The year that you selected, that is the year that you're saying that graduation requirements, or what was the determination for the year on those?
The
graduation
year is
requirements for FinEd?
Well, so yeah, the year is the first graduating class in the state that would have been required to have personal finance content. So
even if that content's like embedded in another course, like in economics or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. I'll contact
which is what
you
makes it really
about,
tricky. Yeah.
Yeah. Where you came up with 98 for Michigan, because I'm kind of curious about that. So thank you.
What do you think it is? I'm curious.
Well, we made econ a graduation requirement in 2007. So maybe there
was it
standards.
In the standards in social studies, probably? Yeah.
I'm guessing 98, they came into the standards and then became a graduation requirement in 2007.
Yeah, I think there was one state for which there was only one standard, and that was the only time we didn't include standards. But generally, when there are standards, there are quite a few standards. Yeah, so that's probably where that came in. And there aren't many. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you.
Oh, I was going to say there's not many pre-2000. So, and those were the ones we were like really carefully vetting, because some earlier research had some even earlier years for a lot of states. So we spent a lot of time on those, but I would love to hear more.
Okay. Well, we can follow up on that. And my another question was, and I think you were maybe addressing this toward the end of what you were saying, like with females, we don't see any change, but did you break it down by different types of behavior or different types of knowledge, credit, or budgeting or anything like that? I mean, do we know that there's certain areas where maybe it does work or it's not working?
Yeah, so I think
With
in
that
terms
specific
of,
subgroup.
yeah, looking just at females, I know in others, so it's really hard. When we did work with credit reports before, you don't see any demographics, and kind of similar in other studies, anytime you have administrative data, you can't see gender. But Melody Harvey's work does show some clear improvements. So reductions in payday borrowing and payday loans for females as well as for males. We also do see more savings for females. We see more retirement planning for females. So it's not like they're just making terrible decisions. We didn't see any movement on the budgeting question, but I think that's just how it's asked. So that makes it a little bit trickier. But of the 5 items in the scale, which are just more like how you're feeling about your month-to-month, day-to-day finances, your goals for the future, and do you have money left over at the end of the month, we're not seeing any change. I think that money left over at the end of the month question is also a bit tricky because you might now know that you don't have money left over at the end of the month, right? So that's the tricky thing about financial education is like there are things that go in both directions in some of these questions where more education usually means you know what's going on, but that might actually just mean you report more accurately.
You might feel worse about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Early, I have a question. And actually,
Yeah.
how many states would you say include significant personal finance and economic content together in a standalone course? For example, here in Virginia, our economics and personal finance course is supposed to be split 50-50 between economics and personal finance. In New York, I count an economics class that has one significant unit in personal finance, and I would count both of those as mixed personal finance economics. Do you know offhand how many states you count, or can you speak to that have like?
I think it's tricky because tell me if this is wrong, but in Virginia it's a full year, right?
It's a full year course. It's supposed to be a semester, one semester personal finance. Yeah.
So in a lot of the other ones, in my mind, I would actually count that as a full semester of personal finance, because a lot of the other ones are one semester split econ personal finance. And there's a huge variety in terms of the standards and what they look like. Like as an economist, I would say most of those do not look like econ classes. They look like personal finance classes with some opportunity costs and like, look at the fluctuations in income or look at this macroeconomic model. And now let's think about the importance of insurance. Like I wouldn't necessarily call them as much economics. And in a lot of cases, I feel like sometimes the standards were just like teach economics. And then they got really specific when you integrated personal finance within that economics class. And it was like, teach these very specific topics. So it's kind of an interesting move in that way. But to answer your first question, I would say it's probably close to 10-ish states that have econ in personal finance, and probably I think it's 7 as of now that have standalone courses in personal finance, like full semesters, which I would count Virginia in. Based on
I counted 13 blended classes.
13 blended.
I'm glad that my count is close to your count.
That's my like guess out of my head.
Yeah.
There's a lot that are standards, and most of those are just states that are very local control, where they are never going to get a course requirement in any way. And like standards are the only way to make sure things are taught. But I will say that in our data, we found that in states that had these standalone requirements, there was 100% compliance. In states with the integrated requirements, there was only about 33% compliance. So if you go to each of the schools' websites and try to figure out what they're actually requiring based on their online course catalogs, a lot of them are actually not even doing anything.
Hey, Carly.
Hey.
Thank you for this information. I'm Sandy in North Carolina. The information that is on there for North Carolina is kind of tricky, because 2005 was the year that it was legislated that all students must have personal finance, but it said by the year 2007. But
Okay.
the standards were not updated till 2010 to actually include personal finance. So might want to adjust that 2005 date for North Carolina.
We should definitely talk more offline. So that was based like on the legislation. But yeah, you're seeing how tricky all of these are. It's really hard to figure out the year. We've
And
spent
now
a lot of time. Yeah.
So now
Go
we
ahead.
have an actual mandate that a new class being required this year, but actual standards were not written until 2010 and then adopted in 2012. So it's crazy how long it took from the date it was legislated till it actually made it to approved standards.
Were they added in something else before then? That's usually
Yeah.
how we end up picking it up. So they were not in just in social studies.
They were,
Okay.
there was an economic strand in social studies, but then in 2005, they legislated that there needed to be, that all students must have personal finance by 2007. And then the standards were updated in 2010 and adopted in 2012. That included a personal finance strand K through 8, and then at the high school at the civics and economics course.
Great. Perfect. Yeah, I'll follow up with you. I'll look at where we got that from.
Okay.
Carly, I would say the same thing is true about Texas. This is Princeton Williams. I'm now in Georgia, but got hired at the Dallas Fed in 2006, and it was a really uneven start to personal finance education in Texas because like there was legislation in 2006 for the class of 2006, 2007 that it should be incorporated. It was like a list of concepts. They weren't standards. And then a few years later, the standards were redone for economics to split them about half and half. And, and then much later, there was a personal finance class that was an elective was added. So Texas has
so Texas is one that I'm super confident in. We've talked to like probably 15 to 20 people there when we did that, because we actually did one of our first papers completely in Texas. I'm okay if everyone didn't comply. And actually, I think if anything, that makes it look more effective than we're actually making it look in terms of our other paper. But I know that there was a huge jump in the number of people required in 2007 to do personal finance in Texas. That's the thing about these policies is as a researcher, I want to be super conservative with these years and say, if there was a shock in what you're writing, and this is the first graduation cohort that we think should be affected, then if I say this is earlier than it is, then that's going to bias me against finding something. And I know like the world out there is very anti-financial education, I'm sure, as a lot of you guys do. So if I feel like I'm stacking any cards in my favor, then that's just going to make the whole field look worse, right? So it's probably, if anything, more effective than I'm saying, but I'd rather understate it than overstate it. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much,
But
Carly.
I want to know more about like all of your mandates. So definitely send me emails. I would love to have as much detail as possible.
Okay, awesome. So we're at the actual end of the conference day, but back in the main room, if anybody wants to hang out and continue to chat, we're having optional happy hour BYOB. So I'm going to head over there. Anybody else that wants to hang out, just head back over to the main room. And Carly, again, thank you. Wonderful as always. Great to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Carly.
Oh,
Thanks.
wait, I'm getting yelled at. Wait, because we have to take a photo. So please don't hang up yet. Are you coming?
Tell them to go to the Zoom one and I'm going to take a picture.
Okay, she says, this is Elise, our social media director. Please go to the main room so we can take a photo, and then you're free to do whatever you want. So please head back over. The link's in the chat.